Thank you for joining our online event today. I'm Caroline Staten, the Executive Director of Transition US, and our principal aim is to provide practical support to the leaders of transition initiatives, those who are mulling over starting an initiative, and community leaders working on resilience building within their communities. So today we have with us Joanne Poyarau, and her discussion today, her slide presentation, and our Q&A will all be focused around building a vibrant local economy. And Joanne describes this as an economy is like an ecosystem. It has many interrelated and interdependent parts. To build a resilient local economy, we must recognize and cultivate many different aspects of change. So Joanne will be leading us through her work and her research in this. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this call over to Joanne. And Joanne is the initiator of Transition Los Angeles. She directs the environmental change makers in the Westchester neighborhood of Los Angeles. She's an economist by training and was a CPA in public practice for 13 years. She studied many resources in post-growth economics and recently led a discussion series on transition enterprises. Her views on ecosystems are informed by permaculture and by soil building for organic food gardens. And her collected writings on resilient economies can be found at resilienteconomy.net. And Joanne also does a lot of wonderful blog posts for Transition US, and those are archived on our website. How many of you on this call are involved in some form of alternative economics, whether it be time banking, bartering, alternative currencies, alternative investments, what have you? Press 1 if you are involved in some form of alternative economics, and press 2 if you're not. So this is coming in now. It looks like of the participants that responded, 35% are involved, 30% are not involved, and then a number didn't respond to the question, Joanne. So that gives a little indication of who's on the call and what they might be bringing to this and what they might want to be learning. So we'll go through and we might be asking you some more questions in this vein. So thank you so much, and thank you so much, Joanne, for joining us today, and turning it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Carl, for setting all this up. It's always fun to be working with Transition US, and I've been working with Transition US since the very beginning, since it was forming, and been blogging there for a number of years. So I've touched on all kinds of topics. If you have the presentation in PDF form, you'll notice that in the lower right of all of the images, there's a little number, and that's sort of like a slide number, so that we can all be kind of on the same page and we pretend we're working together here. I'm going to refer to those slide numbers as we go through, and that way you'll know when to flip, since we don't have someone with a big screen in front of us. I haven't done these national kind of telephone call conference things before too often, and so I'm used to seeing my audience in front of me. I figured, well, we'll do it the flip way. You could see what I look like. Slide number 2 has some pictures of me. If you came to my site in Westchester, the Westchester neighborhood of Los Angeles, you'd probably see me like in the upper right or the lower left, digging in the dirt, teaching classes. I do a lot of that. I do a lot of teaching in organic gardening, food gardening. I've built 2 community gardens, as well as been part of a failed time bank, and as Carolyn said, helped initiate Transition Los Angeles, and I currently run the Environmental Change Makers nonprofit. I trained as a CPA, and I have a business economics degree. So obviously when I got into transition concepts and post-petroleum concepts, post-growth concepts, I started to say, well, what does this have to do with the economy? What's going to happen to all the economic things that I've worked with for my entire career? How are all these sweeping, massive changes going to affect what we know about the economy today? And so for many years, I've been someone who does a lot of deep research in those topics. Let's see, slide number 2 is just my websites and my organizations that I am involved in, Environmental Changemakers and Transition Los Angeles. It's a nice picture of Los Angeles up there. We are the 5th largest city in the world. We're classified as a mega city. And yes, I do indeed live in the middle of all that and work on transition from the heart of that. I live about 6 blocks from LAX International Airport. So I'm not saying all these things from some rural context, but really from the heart of the city. And when we take that perspective, we realize that anytime we're talking about transition, anytime we're talking about post-petroleum solutions, we've really got to consider massive cities. We've got to consider these massive concentrations of people, because transitioning economics is the key to maintaining some semblance of peace as all of the post-petroleum, the downside of petroleum comes about. You can read the works of people like James Howard Kunstler and what they imagine things will be like if we go into this unprepared. So that's why getting into the economic aspects of this was so important to me. Slide number 5 is just a refresher on what we talk about when we're talking about things from a transition viewpoint. We're ultimately talking about how climate change and peak oil are going to impact everything we know of in our society today. Even more so, a couple years back, I took the step of saying it's really 3 things. It's peak oil, climate change, and economic contraction, long-term, ongoing economic contraction. And by contraction, I mean a getting smaller, a tightening, a closing in, a power down of the economy as well. We'll talk more about that throughout the talk. Now, when we say the word peak oil, it's very important to remember what people like Richard Heinberg say about peak oil, that oil is not the only substance for which humanity is at or near peak. We're at or near peak with respect to copper, uranium, arable land, fisheries, forests, fresh water, all of these things we are at or near peak, and that's something that Heinberg calls peak everything. And peak everything is very important to keep in mind when we're talking about economics, because peak everything is ultimately the thing that is going to drive long-term economic contraction and is really going to wipe out any hope of this mythological recovery that people in the media and politics keep saying will come about, that when we're coping with peak everything, those things just are pure fantasy. Slide number 6 is taking us into the concepts of biocapacity. Biocapacity is more of the environmental scientist name for peak everything. It's saying that if we take everything that we have around us, all the raw materials, all the mineral deposits, all the resources that we have on the planet, and we look at how quickly the planet can make more of them, at the current moment, humanity is consuming more than the planet can produce. Humanity is making more waste than the planet can clean up in that same time period. And so environmental scientists call this concept, they call this overshoot, that we have basically gone into a way of living where we are living beyond the capacity of what this planet can produce for us to consume in that same time period that we're consuming it. The plot thickens when we look at this in terms of continents. If we look at it on a continent basis, if we take, again, all the stuff that we have around us, all the fresh, all the resources, all the mineral deposits, all the fresh water, all the arable land, all of this, and we divide this up per capita, we get a unit that they call bioproductive acres. They measure it in hectares. It's a metric unit. And we come up with our fair share. When we divide all that we have, all the stuff, by the number of people we have today, we get our fair share, which comes out to about 2.1 hectares. Our world average consumption is right now at about 2.23. So right there you can see that we have the overshoot is visible, that the world average is really greater than our individual fair share. It gets even worse when we start to look at it by continent, that here in North America, we consume what we call normal. A normal lifestyle is consuming at about 9.4 hectares per capita. So slide number 7, what this really means is that if everybody on the planet lived the way that we do here in North America, the way that we call normal in North America, it would take 5 planets to provide for it all. So when we think about living at 5 planets worth of consumption, and now we say we're going to possibly grow the economy, so what are we going to do, go to 6, 7, 8 planets worth of consumption? Meanwhile, China and India aspire to do the same thing. So in this way, peak everything, biocapacity is really the driving force that puts the ultimate nails in the coffin and says that there's no way that we are going to be able to pull off economic recovery in any shape or form. We're not going to return to the 1990s. Given that that's the fact, we start to say, what are we going to do about it? So slide number 9 is from David Holmgren. He is the co-founder of the Permaculture movement. He works in Australia, and he was really looking at where we are as humanity, that over the years of the Industrial Revolution, we have climbed this enormous industrial ascent. We have climbed to the peak of the mountain. We have used tremendous human ingenuity and creativity to climb up the mountain, and we're sitting at the very peak. And Holmgren says, so what are the possible ways forward? What are the possible options? And he describes 4 options in his work. The first option, for those who don't have the slides, this is showing a graph with an enormous, it's the beginning of a bell curve going up one side, and from the very peak we have 4 options coming off of the top. And the first option is the techno-fantasy scenario, which basically continues the growth line indefinitely. And it says, well, you know, this is the argument that says, you know, pay no attention to what Joanne just said about peak everything. That's all a bunch of malarkey. You know, we can pay scientists to prove that she's wrong. And it says, you know, if we're running out of oil, we'll just take our army, we'll go to the Middle East, we'll conquer the country that's got that, and it'll be ours, and we can keep on going shopping, enjoy your Christmas. Now, we've heard this scene before, and we know how well it works. You'll notice that Holmgren labeled this the techno-fantasy solution. So we know what's going to happen with that one. So the second option that Holmgren envisioned coming off of this enormous industrial ascent was the green tech stability option. And this is the idea that we basically flatline it right where we are at pretty close to the top of the mountain. And this is, you'll hear a lot of talk about this when people talk about steady state economies and things like that, a lot of the people who are into green tech say, yes, this is the way to go. We know that oil's a problem, so instead of oil, we'll switch to solar and wind and all these renewables. And we know that growth is a problem, so we don't have to grow anymore. We'll just sort of stay right where we are. That's the steady state. Well, there's a couple different problems with this. One of the problems is that is the tremendous kick that oil gives us. Oil gives us a phenomenal punch, phenomenal amount of power. There is nothing that replaces that amount of energy density. The second problem with the green tech stability idea is that all of those renewables that are supposedly going to replace oil are not in place at the level they need to be today as we start to feel the pinch of the downside of the oil curve. And they are not geared up in anywhere near the capacity. Plus, they don't give us a lot of solutions as far as transportation, which is our principal use of oil anyway. Okay, so we've got the energy density problem. We got the timing problem of them not being geared up. Another problem that we have is even that adjustment from the ongoing uphill to something that's more of a flat line is a significant adjustment. Realize that every bit of our economic systems, from our basic accounting systems to the way we structure our financial statements to our presumptions about the economy overall and definitions of GDP and our whole financing structure and the interest structure and the stock market, all of these are built on the presumption that growth will continue indefinitely, uninterrupted. So as soon as you start to say, well, we're going to flatline it, you have made such a significant adjustment that we will indeed feel the ouch. It will not be painless. So the green tech stability has, that was 3 of the 4 problems. The 4th problem is the level at which we draw that flat line. If we do what a lot of the steady state people say, we'll just be steady, right about where we are right now. Remember where we are right now. We're at 5 planets worth of consumption. So we're going to continue at 5 planets, and China and India want to come up and join us? How's that going to work out? No, we need to draw that steady state at something much more in line with 1 planet's worth of consumption. So the green tech option should perhaps be called the green tech fantasy scenario. Another option that Holmgren envisioned was the red line on your graph. This is the idea that we ignore the problem a little bit longer. We go further into techno-fantasy and green tech stability, and they obviously don't work out for the things we've just discussed, and at a certain point, it all comes apart. And that's the crash scenario. That's the Mad Max scenario. That's the scenario that says, hey, I got mine, you better got yours. I got a big gun, and I'm going to defend mine. And, I have 2 children growing up in the world, and I sure hope we're not going there. So I devote a lot of time to transition ideas, trying to help people to put in place something a whole lot saner. Holmgren gave us another scenario, which is what he calls the creative descent, the earth stewardship. And this is a gradual slope, for those who don't have the diagram, off of the top of the industrial, the mountain of the industrial ascent. The creative descent, sometimes called the permaculture scenario. On slide number 10, the important thing to remember about the creative descent is it's a descent, that it has as an intrinsic element of it this phasing back from 5 planets worth of consumption to something more in line with 1. It's going to mean decreased energy consumption, what Heinberg calls power down. It's going to mean decreased consumption overall. That's the adjustment from 5 planets worth of consumption down to something more in line with 1. The other important thing to remember is it's also going to mean decreased volume expectations. How many of you have met somebody who's into some sort of green jobs, and when they start talking about their business, the volume expectations that they have with respect to that supposedly green business sound a whole lot like old world economics. The idea that, we're still going to crank out this many units, but, they'll be created by solar and wind, so it'd be better. So volume expectations also need to be adjusted as we go through creative descent. So as we go and analyze any sort of economic thinker, we have to start to say, do they understand peak oil? Do they understand peak everything? Do they understand the increasing costs of climate change? And do they understand what creative descent is truly going to mean? Or are they looking for some sort of a green tech, or are they looking for some way to return to the fantasy of perpetual growth? On slide number 11, we bring our come back to a word that we use a lot in the transition movement, the idea of resilience. To me, resilience means our ability to flex and adapt with whatever comes along. We could also say it's our bounce-back ability. Now, resilience is a dangerous term these days, especially when you're talking about economics, because so many people hear it and they think as soon as you're talking about bounce-back ability, they think you're saying return with a bounce to back to the continuous growth that we had, say, in the 1990s, that we're going to go back, we're going to find solutions and ways to bounce back to that kind of a perpetual growth. And that obviously is nonsense, as we've seen in the previous discussion, that really when we're talking about resilience, we're talking about things like Rob Hopkins is talking about, the ability to cope with shocks to the system without absolutely falling apart into chaos, like Jared Diamond would say. That we are looking at creating an economy that can deal with shocks to the economic system, like, say, the gasoline trucks don't roll into your town for, a week, and so, all transportation grinds to a halt. Can your economy cope with that? Are you that dependent on things outside? The kind of climate events we've seen this year, the droughts across the country and the massive flooding that shut down New York, are we able to cope with that economically? And this is ultimately what resilience means. For those who have the slides, you see that I have a little guy jumping up and down on a trampoline. To me, this is like the symbol of what resilience looks like. In the 1980s, 1990s, when we talked about our economic environment, we were talking about the idea of like a nice solid sidewalk underneath our feet, that we're climbing up this hill, we're walking on this sidewalk, it's nice and level, we can feel it nice and solid beneath our feet, and this is the way that we built our expectations for our business. It's not that way anymore. Now it's much more like the little guy on his trampoline, where he bounces up into the air, and when he comes down, he doesn't know what that surface is going to be like. That surface is ever-changing beneath him. He's bouncing up and down on this surface that's ever-changing beneath him, and this is the business climate of today, and probably will be for most of the rest of our lives. Now I want to say one more thing about this diagram, is the little guy has a smile on his face. And that's very important to remember, is that it is possible to do this and still enjoy life. We can still have a good life and construct that kind of community around us that will make this a fine and happy place to live and to enjoy the fruits of our labor, to enjoy bringing up our children. Slide number 13 is David Holmgren's Permaculture Flower, which I put in here to remind us. Holmgren drew this daisy-shaped diagram. It has 7 petals, and each petal sort of describes a different realm of human endeavor. So often when we think about the environment, we think about like things that really all fall into Holmgren's petal of land and nature stewardship. But there's so many other aspects of human endeavor. He describes built environment, like all of our buildings and everything like that, tools and technology, our energy supply, our means of transportation. Within the transition movement, we understand that every single one of these petals is going to have to undergo enormous transformative change to make it more resilient, to be able to cope with shocks to the system. So culture and education, we're going to be changing the messages we're teaching our children. Health care is going to be changing massively away from the oil-dependent system we currently have. Finance and economics, that's what we're talking about today. Government, I just did a review of a book that was by some thinkers who are trying to imagine what it might be to have a more resilient local government. So that's up on the Transition US blog. That was a very interesting book to read. So slide number 14, for those who don't have it, is a bunch of puzzle pieces just sort of thrown all over, and each one's got a label on it of something that we often think about being part of that alternative economy. I don't like the word alternative, but there's a whole discussion of that on my blog. I'm not going to take up time with that. But, we've got social enterprise, green jobs, austerity, urban agriculture, time banking, local self-sufficiency. These are some of the puzzle pieces, but they're all scattered. They're scattered all over the table. And this is, to me, is an image of why people are very apprehensive talking about transition with respect to economics. Transition economics doesn't feel very solid to people. They say, well, how do I know that I can still have a livelihood, that I can still, afford to feed my children and pay the rent and those kind of things? And the reason it doesn't feel solid is the puzzle pieces are scattered all over the table. We do not have a sense of a cohesive whole. And so because the puzzle pieces are all scattered, any individual puzzle piece feels very fragile and flimsy. Someone says, oh, we have just started a time bank in our neighborhood, and someone else says, yeah, right, good luck paying your mortgage with that. And instantly the time bank feels really fragile. Oh, it's only got 50 members. It doesn't feel like very much, but it's only one of the puzzle pieces. So if I can leave you with anything today, my hope is that I leave you with that image that's on the cover of the puzzle box, that you put up next to your puzzle. So when you go to assemble it, you can see that image and you can go, this is where the pink piece goes and this is where the blue one goes. And you have some sense of how the puzzle pieces get assembled in your local economy, so that as a puzzle piece comes to your tabletop, you can go, that's one of those puzzle pieces she was talking about. That's how that fits in. We need that. We need to keep that alive. Great idea. Sandy over here starting a time bank and Fred over there starting a local currency. Wow, we need all these pieces together, and this is all part of the puzzle. So I hope that, as we go through what we're going to do, as we go through the rest of today's talk, that you have some sense of what the overall puzzle will look like. Now, slide number 15, I call the blueprint. As we said in the introduction, I've done a lot of reading of different people who are imagining what's the way forward with respect to economics. And I ended up making these two enormous stacks of books. You'd have all these thinkers who say, hey, we'll return to, resilience means we're going to return to the growth of the 1990s, and here's how. Okay, that goes in the fantasy stack. Okay, and then there's somebody else who says, well, this is how we put together a time bank, and this is why. And this is someone who's imagining, Janelle Orsi, imagining these wonderful sharing economies and things like that. These are parts of the pieces that we need to have around us. So looking at these things and sort of sorting them, how do we sort them? We need some sort of a blueprint to go forward. When you build a house, you've got a blueprint you can sort of refer to. One of the pieces of a couple of the thinkers that I have read and who really start to understand these. We have Tim Jackson in the UK who was reviewed on Hopkins' blog. I think he's gone to Totnes and spoken there several times now. And he really has an idea about this. In our country, we have James Gustav Speth, who's working out of, he used to be a dean at Yale, and he's really been examining these very intricately. And then we have a whole passel load of other thinkers, Helena Norbert Hodges, who's looking at incredible ideas about localization and what it really means culturally and spiritually. Charles Eisenstein, who's looking at the whole idea of gift economies, but he's also looking, he's got a historical context where he understands that the way that we are right now, we think it's the only way to be because it's all we've ever known for our entire lifetime. But when you take it in a historical context, you realize that humanity has not operated this way for most of our history, that this is a very short-term method of operation, and that once you consider it in that context, you realize that it's short-term because it's at peak society. It's at the peak of the mountain. And so that the idea of once we leave peak, it's probably not going to be this way. And so another resource I discovered was a UK publication by the NEF. I think that I've forgotten what that stands for right now. The NEF was looking at what is a resilient, what are the ingredients of a resilient economy, but even more so, what are the ingredients of the transition? What does it take to go from here to there? What does it take to go from what we have now to something in the future that is much more resilient? Now, their document had to do with a lot of things that are UK-centric. They don't apply to the U.S., so really the contents of their document didn't really help me a whole lot, but their table of contents was awesome. Their table of contents included bullet points like, okay, these are what it takes to transition the economy. And they're saying the great reskilling, the great localization. Hey, we're already talking about those ideas a lot in transition. We're talking about reskilling. We do a lot of reskilling workshops, learning the new skills of power down, all those things. Localization, we need to localize our food supply. We need to localize, a lot of our operations. So these are not strange concepts. But the NEF document goes further. It says the great revaluing. Wow, what is that? Well, if you read things like the Charles Eisenstein's work and you have followed the ideas of Joanna Macy, you really can see that right now there are things in our realm of human activities that have no value in the conventional economy, that we have things we need very much to survive and to move forward and to feel fulfilled and to have a full life and what we would consider a full life, a good life. But yet some of these things do not gain valuation in the mainstream economy that we have today. And what NEF was saying is the great revaluing will be a process by which we are shifting our values so that the things which are supportive of human life, the things which are supportive of environmental stability will gain value within the new economic system. So it's a phenomenal concept, and so revaluing is talking about a shift of what we give value to economically. The great rebalancing is the idea of, you hear it in conventional economics where they're talking about market regulation versus laissez-faire. And so the NEF document is talking about that we are completely out of balance. And you look at work like there's an awesome book that came out, The Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and it really reminds us that we have strayed very far from the kinds of checks and balances that used to go with the debt system, and that a lot of these checks and balances need to come back into play. The best example I saw was in the NEF document where they said, if you were going to play a sports game, you'd have your whole team get on their uniforms, they all get suited up, they run out on the playing field, the other team runs out on the playing field. You wouldn't ever think of hiking the ball without having a set of rules and a referee to tell if the game was played fairly. But yet when it comes to economics, we've got a very different perspective on what that means. How do you play the game fairly? And so the great rebalancing is calling us to rethink that whole discussion differently in order to create something that's much more resilient. The last one here on the list is the great redistribution. And this is something in the NEF document they were talking about distribution of assets, distribution of power, and distribution of time. And they were saying that, well, for instance, in the vernacular we have now everybody understands this idea of the 1% and the 99%. Well, that's a great example of how our distribution at current is completely skewed, completely out of whack, and that there are countries that have much more, they have a much better distribution between people. There are countries where there are caps on how much executive salaries can be. They can only be X percent of how much the lowest paid worker is and things like that, that you have sort of checks and balances on the distribution of assets, time, and power. So we're going to go through changes in our distribution as well. Slide number 16. So all of that's a really interesting discussion, but it's really theoretical. And, first slide, I'm one of those people who, I get out in the garden and I put my shovel in the dirt, and I like to, I really feel like I'm getting something accomplished when I can get down there and see, do something with a shovel and see some real progress. So what are practical tools for making all of this blueprint idea come about? And so we're going to spend the rest of the talk here talking about those practical tools. And first among those practical, first as we start to talk about those practical tools, for those who don't have the slides, I've got an image of some guys, trapeze artists, and a guy just about to go flipping through the air here. Right now, the idea of moving into economic tools that are other than our conventional economic tools is incredibly scary to us. And it should be, because we do not have a safety net. That guy in the picture would never consider doing those flips without having a massive net beneath him to catch him if he fell. Right now, we have an economic structure that we are completely enmeshed in, and that it takes a lot of bravery to go outside that system because we don't have any sense that there is a safety net to catch us if we fall. So when we're putting in place the practical tools, it's important to realize we are putting in place a safety net for our local communities to survive as all of this economic impact goes down. And believe me, what we've seen in the past is only a hiccup compared to what most thinkers anticipate is ahead of us. So we need those safety nets in place in our local communities. We need to work to build them. As we build those safety nets, it's important to realize that these are probably the building blocks of the new economy, that the practical tools we put in place at this point in time will probably linger for a very long period of time, and they will call people to think about how this transition is going on from what we had yesterday to what we will have at some point in the fairly distant future, that we're putting in place at the same time the building blocks of that new future. And when we realize that our safety net is also building blocks, that's when the blueprint comes in and becomes very important. That's when we need to keep in mind all of those things of the prior slide where we're talking about revaluing, rebalancing, redistribution. If we go and we put in place a safety net in our hometown today that doesn't take into account revaluation, a different way of balancing, a different way of distributing assets, power, and time than we have had in the economy of the past, then we haven't built anything new. And in fact, we have kept one foot in the old world, and we have basically doomed our new safety net that it's really hooked to the old world, and it isn't going to do us a whole lot of good. So it's very important to keep in mind the blueprint as you construct your safety net so that you really are moving into a very different paradigm economically. So what are some of the tools of this safety net? Slide 17, and if you took the time, in the very first slide there was a link. I made a little puzzle online, and you can move the pieces around. You can assemble this diagram. It's kind of fun. This is what the puzzle pieces look like when you take them from being scattered all over the table and you start to put them together. For those who don't have the slide, it's a spiral made of puzzle pieces. And the spiral starts, of course, like all spirals do, tight on the inside, and as we come to the outer rim, it starts to get a little bit loose. Because where we are sitting today, immersed in the conventional economy, it's very hard for us to envision much more than the first few basic steps, the beginning, the safety net. And we're really going to have to get deep into it in order to have some good answers for what goes on as we spin further out into that spiral and start to build the new future. But for the time being, we can pretty clearly identify what the core of our spiral is, what the beginnings of our safety net are. And I would venture to say, when you start to look at the ingredients of a resilient local economy, like this diagram, as an assembled puzzle, instead of being scattered all over the table, it starts to feel a whole lot more solid. When you start to realize you need all these elements, even more so, you start to look around your local community and go, hey, we've got that over there. Sam's doing that piece over here. Frank's doing that one over there. And you start to see how much really is around you already. It's just hidden behind the smoke screen of the conventional economy. When you start to see it as a cohesive whole, it starts to feel a whole lot more solid. And that's the point when you are able to say we can start to attract more people to taking that risk and taking that jump on that flying trapeze, because there is a greater sense that there is a safety net in place in our local community. So slide number 18 really describes the keystone of that spiral, the very center core of that spiral. And right there I've put inner resilience. Now, within our transition groups, we talk about inner resilience a whole lot. We talk about, concepts of Joanna Macy. We talk about the ideas of Pachamama. We talk about all kinds of different ways of viewing humanity in a different way in relation to the ecosystems of the earth, that we're changing our inner story that we tell ourselves. What the heck does this have to do with economics? This is supposed to be an economics talk you signed on for. And what am I doing talking about inner resilience? Think about it this way. In American society today, we identify each other, we identify ourselves in economic terms. We identify, our whole identity is caught up in what kind of car do you drive, what neighborhood do you live in. You meet somebody for the first time, they shake your hand, they learn your name, and they say, what do you do? So all of a sudden economics is right there. How do you make your living? What's your place in the world? And your whole definition, your self-definition is caught up in it. So now if your self-definition is caught up in the big house or the big car, or caught up in a certain kind of W-2 wage, and suddenly that's not there anymore, it causes this enormous quaking in your inner identity. And this is where we need the inner resilience. And we need the communities, a supportive community around us who's going to understand these concepts, and instead of saying, sorry you lost your job, we'll help you find a new one, you'll find a new W-2 job in a little bit, something will come up. Instead of that, they're really going to understand that this is part of the enormous sweeping changes that are taking place in society, that there are new directions, and they're not going to look like repeating the old patterns, that they're going to look very different. And they may look different from what you went to school for or where you thought you identified yourself in the past. And so this is where inner resilience comes in, the ability to flex and adapt in our inner core and within our social circles so that we can make the changes necessary to move where we need to. Slide number 19 is the idea of cash conservation. And this is the second puzzle piece. This is saying the U.S. dollars you have now, be wise with them. Start thinking very seriously about how you spend the U.S. dollars you have now, because you might very well right now be at peak earning for the rest of your lifetime. It might not get any better than this, regardless of what socioeconomic status you are at right now. That cash conservation is saying, look to all these other realms of ways of getting your needs met. That Janelle Orsi's written a brilliant book called The Sharing Economy that explores all these ways of swapping to get things that you need, in creating barter systems, creating exchange programs, creating cooperative programs within your neighborhood so that you can get things done for your lifestyle, for a full and complete lifestyle without the use of U.S. dollars. The more you can accomplish without U.S. dollars, the more U.S. dollars you will have left over for those things you can't get through barter, exchange, do-it-yourself, swapping, simplification, all of these other tools. So cash conservation is taking into account all of those. And slide number 20 is another aspect of that, which is saying we need to understand debt. Within our society, we are very caught up in this whole idea of debt and leveraging and interest. All of these ideas were tremendously appealing to us throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Everybody was leveraged. You know, all of these things were part of the growth economy. And there's the key word, the growth economy. Debt, leveraging, interest are all excellent tools when the economy is growing, when you are in a growth mode economy. What debt means is when you expect your future earnings to be higher than what you have now. Debt means I'm going to go and I'm going to take a little piece of that brilliant future, and I'm just going to take that little piece back to now, and I'm going to spend it now for what I need, whether that's a college education or a car to get me around or whatever it would be. I'm going to spend that little piece now, and when I get to that brilliant future, I'll have so much plenty that I won't notice a little bit of it going to debt service and paying off the debt that got me to where I was. Concept works great when the economy is growing, but we aren't there anymore. Right now, we're in a contracting economy. We're in a long-term contracting economy, and so we are in a very different scenario. Right now, if you go out and you take out debt, you are taking a little piece from a leaner future, and you're carrying it back to today when you are in better place, and you're consuming that little bit of that leaner future today in addition to the peak that you're on. Now when you get to that leaner future, not only is it leaner than what you would have had today, but it's also short because you have to have debt service. So you have less than the lean future that you would have. So taking out debt in a down economy hastens your demise. Now this means credit card debt, this means student debt, this means car loans, this means mortgages, this means governmental debt and voting on the newest school bond that your local official came up with. Any debt whatsoever is taking from that leaner future, consuming it now where we have more plenty, and when we get to that leaner future, we're going to be that much more short. So debt hastens our decline. Slide number 21, which is bullet point 3. This is not bullet point, but practical tool number 3. Practical tool number 3 is rethinking jobs. Right now you listen to just about any politician who will sell you on the idea that green jobs are the salvation of the future. They will boost the economy back into growth mode. They'll help the environment. They'll make everybody happy, wealthy, and wise. Well, not very likely. When we start to talk about jobs, we need to go to a historical context, and people like Charles Eisenstein are good for this, helping us do this. Also, things like the debt, the first 5,000 years, to really realize that the way that we're living right now has only been this way for a very short period of human experience. That right now, where we're gaining a W-2 salary from some globalized corporation, that isn't likely to continue. Given all the problems we talked about at the beginning of this talk, those globalized corporations are going to have one heck of a difficult time continuing as they are on their current models with the deeper onset of peak oil. They're going to have a really tough time with peak everything. they just aren't cut out for that. They are cut out for a growth economy. And so the idea of globalized business shedding jobs and not replacing them and people losing their W-2 jobs will continue, and it will worsen. And so as we look at that as a prospect, then losing your W-2 job and going to find another W-2 job is absolute absurdity. Instead, I think that we are much more likely to see, slide number 22, practical tool number 4, resilience building local businesses. We're much more likely to become proprietors rather than corporate employees. This is the way that most of mankind, most of human history has been. You know, we had the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. Those were the ways those guys identified. They said, hey, I'm the guy, you know, you can come to me for meat. I know where my local supplier is. I know how to kill the animal and to put it into something that you can then put in your soup pot. You know, I am the baker. I can produce bread. You know, a practical, concrete skill that is something that people really need for survival mode. Here we're talking about like the bottom of Maslow's pyramid. We're talking about basic human needs. We're not talking about local businesses that are like, you know, the nail salon where you can get, you know, your exotic porcelains or something like that. We're not talking about the local car rental agency. Those are big in my neighborhood right near LAX. You know, and they say, oh, we're a local business. Well, big wow, you're totally tied up in, you know, a petroleum economy. So these are going to be businesses where people are producers rather than consumers. We talk about this some in the transition movement, but maybe not quite as much as we should. I was at a talk where David Holmgren used the phrase, jack of all trades and a master of one. This is how we will be going forward into the future. And our reskilling classes within the transition movement, I think, really help further that, where, you know, we're all picking up little bits of things, learning to can, learning to grow some food, learning to repair our clothes, or darn socks, as Hopkins is always putting on his blog. You know, we're learning many different we're learning many different techniques and tools for this future, and we will be a master of one, where you'll say, I'm the guy who can come in and set up your rain barrels. You know, I am the butcher, I am the baker, I am the candlestick maker. And that will be your principal skill that you hold out to your community, but it doesn't discount the fact that, you know, if I grow a bumper crop of peaches, then I take that to the local harvest exchange and I swap that out and I come home with a load of, you know, peppers, zucchinis, and onions. I have then had a valid economic transaction that didn't involve cash, and it didn't involve my principal trade. It involved more of one of my, you know, jack of all trades kind of things. That we will have many of these kinds of transactions. So that brings us to slide number 23, which is practical tool number 5, a multiplicity of financial vehicles. As we move forward into a more resilient local economy, realize that right now what we live in is a monocrop. And as a gardener, you know, we talk often about, describe a monocrop as like visualizing, you know, the fields that you see in the Midwest where it's, you know, corn as far as the eye can see, just one crop. And as a gardener, you know that when you've got a monocrop, that is like a magnet for every kind of pest under the sun. And that is also the ticket to soil depletion, nutrient depletion, erosion, water issues, all of these kinds of things, soil-borne illness, all kinds of things that you have that come with a monocrop. That more progressive food producers are now going to polycropping, which means growing many different kinds of plants all in the same spot, immediate vicinity, and the plants have symbiotic relationships. They help each other out. They work together to create a whole ecosystem that's producing food. The same applies in our economy, and the same applies for our financial vehicles. Right now, our monocrop is the U.S. dollar. Right now, if you don't trade a U.S. dollar for it, we tend to tell each other, well, that wasn't an economic transaction. Not so. What's really an economic transaction? It's really just a transaction between people. It really comes back to people. And so within our local communities, there are many ways of facilitating that transaction between people. We could have time banks, which many people in the U.S. are familiar with, or LET system, which are the same idea used around the world, more open source. Some people talk about local currencies like you see in Totnes or Ithaca, New York, or Berkshire. Local currencies are part of this multiplicity. Sharing arrangements like all the wonderful ideas in Janelle Orsi's book. I can't mention that enough. Am I plugging her book or what? But you've got to see it. That there are so many ways that we can get our needs met, so many ways we can facilitate transactions between people, that all of these are part of broadening from this monocrop into something that's more like a polycrop. Why is this important? When you hear a speaker like Stoneleigh, Nicole Foss, and she talks about she anticipates this massive deflation happening where there won't be enough money supply to go chasing after the goods that we all need. Well, we have tremendous power within our local communities to free up quote-unquote money supply by creating alternate ways to create transactions between people. It doesn't need to freeze up because you don't have U.S. dollars. It can go on. Transactions between people can happen very fruitfully at the local level between people using alternate ways of creating those transactions. So we've got our gift economies, we've got our straight barter, we've got harvest distribution that I mentioned before, and yes, a few U.S. dollars. But U.S. dollars don't have to be the lion's share of your household budget anymore, because you start within your local community to create all these other avenues for ways to facilitate transactions between people. And by the way, all of these different vehicles start to bring people together in new and different ways than we've ever combined in our local communities before. And that is ultimately what creates tighter communities and what creates more resilient relationships within our local communities. Slide number 24, which is practical tool number 6. As we move into those new financial vehicles, we're going to start thinking very differently about the word investment. Right now, if I said the word investment, you probably think about the stock market and the big banks. If you want to invest, you go to some office and you give them your hard-earned U.S. dollars, and they do some magical thing with it. And in the old days, they used to give you back a nice rate of return. These days, not necessarily. But we're going to end up rethinking all of that as we move into transition economics. We're going to have to be redefining what is an investment in this new economy. And our investments are going to have to be shoring up resilience-building activities within our local communities. It just really needs to happen. Right now, some of these little resilience-building businesses can't get conventional bank loans. Well, how are we helping them to finance themselves within our local community? We can create vehicles to do that. If you have the slides in the upper left, there's a photograph of some guys talking that's clipped from a peak moment video that was done about lion investing. You can find this video on YouTube. It's brilliant. It's a guy created basically what are simple salons where people who had something to invest and people who needed investment in their business could meet, and they could start to do transactions. The key here in this investment is keeping in mind the SEC regulations and understanding them. Michael Schumann's book, Local Money, does have a good chapter in there about SEC regulations. So, this is something to keep aware of, or get somebody on your team, in your local team, who understands what those are, so that you know how not to go down the wrong path. But at the same time, there's plenty of latitude for what we can do. Also, keep in mind what the ideas that somebody like Charles Eisenstein talks about, where he says that we really need to be rethinking this whole idea of interest. Remember, we talked a little bit ago about what debt means, that every time Eisenstein makes the really powerful point that every time that we create an interest-bearing vehicle, that interest, that requirement of interest, basically is sucking the lifeblood out of the underlying entity. So whether that is microloans in third world countries or setting up a local bakery in your hometown, when you're setting it up with debt-based financing that has interest rates on it, you are sucking the lifeblood out of the very thing you thought you were supporting. And so we're going to be thinking very differently about interest in terms of what investment means. People say to me, well, what about investing for retirement? Perhaps some of the best investment you could make for your retirement right now is a non-cash transaction. It's investing your time in setting up this safety net within your local community so that there is a stable and safe local community as we experience the greater repercussions of peak everything as this all goes down. That is the ticket to having a safe and stable place to retire, is really investing your time now to make sure that some of these things come into place. Slide number 25, this is bullet point 7. This is new economic indicators. Economic indicators are things like you see on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, GDP, the interest rate, the unemployment rate, all these things. They're measurement devices, and currently we have a certain set of them that's been used for a long time, basically since the 1930s and 40s, most of these tools. And we tell each other that, you know, when GDP goes up, we must be living better. Well, there was an enormous study done by let's see, what is his name? John Talbert and a team, and it's called the Genuine Progress Indicator. And he discovered that although GDP has skyrocketed in recent decades, our sense of well-being has not. Our sense of whether we're doing better, whether we're as well off as we had been in the past, it plateaued in the 1970s. And in fact is dipping a little bit at this point. And yet GDP is like at an all-time high. You know, it's just like absolutely skyrocketed during that same time period. In other words, GDP isn't measuring our sense of whether we have a better life. But yet when we see it on the front page of the financials, we presume that GDP has got to go up so that we feel like we're having a better life. So in my little example, I go back to the garden and I say, okay, well, why is this? Let's look at this from a gardener's standpoint. GDP measures a flow rate. It's kind of like saying how much water is coming out of the end of my garden hose. It's flowing. I can make it flow fast. I can make it flow slow. It's a flow rate. So how much water is coming out of the end of my garden hose doesn't tell me very much about how healthy my apple tree is. That the degree of flow with GDP isn't really telling me a whole lot about how healthy our sense of well-being is. For that, I need different indicators. I need to know, you know, how many bushels of fruit did the apple tree produce? How many inches of growth did it put on? What are the color of its leaves? You know, does it look healthy overall? You know, is it producing more fruit than it did last year? That tells me about the health of the apple tree. Those are different measurements than that flow rate out of the garden hose. And so we need to shift to different indicators that are going to tell us the stuff we need to know, like decreased carbon emissions or number of bicycles on the roads of your hometown, decreased number of vehicles on the road of your hometown, number of transactions conducted in the local currency, all these kinds of things that will give you a sense of whether you're headed for the right target or not. And so we'll be developing these. There's some transition steps that Hopkins et al. From Totnes have fed our way about this, but I think we're going to get a whole lot further into this as we start to talk about transition economics. Practical tool number 8, redefining success. So with practical tool number 8, we've kind of come full circle. We're back to one of those concepts that you're scratching your head and going, how is this an economics concept again? Right now, we define success in a very limited way, and it really has to do with asset accumulation. It has to do with the fancy, glossy things that we have around us. But already we're seeing a redefinition of people rethinking what it means to live the good life. And as we start to do this as a society, we start to define what is a successful entrepreneur, what is a successful business, what means for a successful business. Is it just their profits, or is it their degree of social engagement? This is where we start to talk about, the whole realm of social enterprises. We start to look at what impact are they making in their local community, where are they sourced from as far as the goods that they're selling. So many different aspects of what constitutes success, so that when it comes down to it, within the economy of the new future, some of the businesses that would seem to be successes by today's measurement standards aren't being very successful by redefinition standards. And this is the point at which we will have really started to shift a whole viewpoint from an economic standpoint. So with that, I'll kind of come to slide 27, which brings us back to our spiral puzzle pieces diagram. And we'll sort of shift gears here in the conference. But what I'm hoping that I've done is shown you like the first 8 of the puzzle pieces and said, this is how the rudimentary tools go together, and they are interrelated. They are not standalone pieces. You're not just setting up a time bank and saying, well, we have a resilient local economy. That's only one fraction of one of the puzzle pieces. A time bank is a fraction of the multiple currencies, but there are other currencies you need also. There was someone here when we were talking early in LA, we were talking about, do we need, time banks the way of the future, or local currencies? And one of our transition members said, oh, but we need them all. And that was like, to me, the big aha moment, is like, we need to be expanding our quote-unquote money supply. We need to be expanding these financial horizons. We need to be making sure that as we set up our resilient local businesses, they are able to accept some of their trade in some of these alternative non-U.S. dollar currencies, and they understand the process, and that is part of the definition of what makes them a resilient local business. So all of these pieces come together and start to form the safety net. When you see the safety net assembled, suddenly it feels a whole lot more solid. It doesn't feel like those scattered pieces all over the table. It starts to feel like something that you can wrap your mind around, and you can say, yes, this could actually support me. This could actually, I could move forward with raising my family with this. And it starts to give you that sense of, I really could take a risk on this. And so that is ultimately the place that we need to get to within ourselves and within our transition circles, so that others feel that they can also take that risk and dip their toe into the waters of these different looking tools and venture into a more resilient sense of what our transactions between people could be. So I have written about each of these steps over the past year on the Transition US blog. The names have changed a little bit as I've massaged these ideas and been thinking about them, but a lot of the underlying resources are on the Transition US blog. They're also on my resilienteconomies.net blog. You can find them there, and you can download the slideshow through the Transition US website. Those of you who, all of you can look. Most of these slides have at the bottom a reference to where you can read more about the underlying pieces of each of these practical tools. I'm currently writing these out in the form of little booklets. The first booklet is now available, and it really talks about the first part of the talk all the way through the Holmgren industrial ascent and energy descent concepts and the 5 planets worth of consumption. That is all available at the current moment through a small booklet through our envirochangemakers.org site. So with that, I'll turn it back to Carolyn Staten, and she can manage questions.
Great. Thank you, Joanne. That was very rich, very, very rich, and I'm glad you're putting those booklets together, and we'd be happy to link to that. So why don't you send me that link, and we'll add that to this page with this information. That would be wonderful. And again, just really rich, lots of info. And want to see now of the participants who has a question or a comment, and you can press 1 on your keypad. So that would be helpful, and I'll call on you as they come in. First one is Manu. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but you're up.
Yes, my name is Manu, and I'm calling from Gilroy, California. Well, the first thing, I thank you, Joanne. Excellent. I would like to hopefully get the recording of this conversation or this presentation, so that way I can present it to the community at the those people that I've been coming across that are thinking about transition. So that would be an invaluable thing to me for this community. And so the other was that you've been mentioning a lot of references to various people. So hopefully I can get links to those or the names of those people where you ended up getting all this information. And the only real reason would be to share it with other people who may be part of your puzzle or our puzzle pieces. And so that's.
Well, thank you, Manu.
That's it. Yeah. Thank you.
If you get a hold of the PDF or of the slideshow, each slide of the practical points has a link on the bottom, and for the most part, those show all the places that I got the information. I tend to think of myself as like that little, sea creature that assembles all the little pebbles and all the little shells and sticks them on himself and says, well, look, now it looks pretty. It all goes together. I assemble a lot of ideas from other places, but I try very hard to continue to credit all the places that those ideas came from so that people can go back to them. So the way you can do that is one, through the slideshow, the links that are embedded in the slides. You can also go back to the Transition US blog. Those are rich with links, and all the titles of all these books are in those blog posts that I had done. Also, as the booklets come out, they will certainly include all the resources as well. But as I said, there's only the first of the booklets is available right now. Eventually, there will be 8.
And
I thank you.
And just a comment on the recording, too. The recording will be available in a few days. It takes us a few days to master it, but that will be available, and participants on this call will be notified when that is ready. You'll receive an email, and also we'll be having it on our website in our archived online events, so you can find it there, too. And we have another question or comment from Rains Cohen. Go ahead, Rains.
Hey, coming to you from Berkeley Co-Housing, California. We've got a small group together with a couple of leaders from Fellowship for Intentional Community who have been practicing some of this. I really appreciate the framing of the presentation, but I really like the idea that it's not any one of these that is the solution. It's so easy for people to say, we've got the solution, it's it, and everybody should be this way. But partnerships between organizations, like the Bali Business Alliance for local economies, that seem to be people bringing together their different framings, their different focus, different pieces of the puzzle, but bringing them together, and the extent we can learn from each other, especially in the area of the human communications, the inner resilience you speak of, and the process skills that people in the community have been practicing for a long time, to take that out to the community and help people with that.
Well, I think the process skills, like when I hear the word process skills, my mind instantly goes to like the work of Starhawk and the brilliant empowerment manual that she put out. And in my opinion, she left the best chapter out. I don't know why that happened, but on her website you can download a PDF of like the ultimate best chapter. And if you're running any sort of a group, transition, non-transition group, go to Starhawk's website and download the PDF of the it's something like the 5-fold path to better meetings or something like that. Awesome as far as an orientation to the different kinds of process skills that are out there. But to me, the whole process skills field is speaking to this, the NEF on the blueprint, the idea of the redistribution of power and really getting that discussion going, getting the rebalancing, the revaluing happening again, so that, here I'm talking about page number 15, I'm talking about that revaluing, rebalancing, and redistribution is really only going to come about when we try different ways to work together that don't look like the old hierarchical pyramid structure. And, I think that we see some of that in today's corporations trying different management pools, but yet they are so entrenched in the old system as far as the economics of their businesses that they can't really go there. It's really going to take us working grassroots and working with much smaller scale businesses and trying different economic models. When we set up the Environmental Changemakers as a nonprofit, for one thing, we operated, you can read all of this on the Transition US blog. I've been blogging for years about, when you set up an organization, you don't have to go right to the 501c3. You don't have to go straight to the nonprofit. You can do a ton without any cash whatsoever. And we existed for 7 years with no cash whatsoever. And we just recently incorporated and started our journey towards 501c3. And we made it an intentional decision that we would do so, and along the way our journey would be an exploration of how the ideas of Charles Eisenstein and these other thinkers who are talking about the non-cash economy might impact a business model. How would a business model change and evolve when it's starting to take into account this whole panorama of the economy, shall we say, the economy beyond cash? That cash limits us so much that we're only thinking about this monocrop, but that there's so much more out beyond that that we have disavailed ourselves of, and that right now it's time for us to pick up the reins and go back there. And so that's where all these other tools go. And so, there's going to be a reinvention of everything from basic accounting practices to, how do we give credit for these things? How do you value these things and put them in a cohesive form to present a financial? All of these things are the R&D of the new economic future. We've got to explore these things. We've got to figure these things out. So it's tremendously exciting. Again, remember, Holmgren talks about us climbing the industrial ascent, and he says that the creative descent is about applying the same human creativity and ingenuity to consciously designing a way down. And if we're consciously designing the way back down that mountain, part of this is going to go into this. There are people who are, now we're starting to see more widespread use of the word degrowth. And degrowth really describes this conscious design process, as opposed to allowing the economy to go into free fall, into Jared Diamond's collapse scenarios. We're instead saying we're going to make a conscious descent and we're going to design the way down. And part of that is going to be designing these new pieces of the economy, the parts that we abandoned in this brief, 200 years of the industrial age.
Thank you for that, Joanne. And I just wanted to mention a couple of things that you mentioned just right now in your response was Starhawk. And we did a webinar recently with her. And if you look in our online training archives, you can listen to that. And it also there's a link to the 5-fold path that you alluded to, Joanne, as well as there's a webinar on our website too with Charles Eisenstein. That's also very good. So I just want to reference that. And we are out of time, and there are no other questions. So I'm going to just ask you, Joanne, for final comments, and then just do a brief wrap up. So please go ahead with any final comment that you might have.
Well, Rains mentioned Bali, and somebody else had mentioned Bali in their sign-in when they signed on to register for this. And Bali is the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, and it's a national organization. There's chapters in a lot of large cities. And it's a very interesting organization in that it would seem to dovetail very much with what we're talking about here today. However, Bali is very caught up in what I described when I was talking about Holmgren's green tech stability. They don't get the idea of volume constraints. They don't get the idea of, a lot of them don't get the idea of transitioning to this whole panorama of alternative tools, this safety net that we've got to have in place for their ideas to work. And so, if you're working with Bali, that's is very important to help them see they are a piece of the puzzle, but the puzzle is, you are that little. They too are that little guy jumping on the trampoline with the surface ever changing beneath them. That this is part of the secrets to their survival economically is broadening their focus, but also that it's not just about greening the old model, it's about a transformative model because we've got to do it to survive. The old model can't just be greened. The old model has some very deep, serious, fatal flaws to it, and that's why it's coming apart at the seams. And so as it comes apart at the seams, we still need to facilitate all those transactions between people so that we can still feed our families, so that we can still keep peace in our local communities. And ultimately, that's what the safety net is about, and that's what assembling this local puzzle piece is about. So I encourage you to hop on the Transition US website in a couple days when Carl and Carolyn have all these links set up. I'll have on there a link to an image of the puzzle, and you can start to label the puzzle and say, oh, I know Fred does this over in the neighborhood to the south of me, and this one over here is Judy's doing this up 2 blocks over, and you can start to label it for your local community, and that's where you start to appreciate the richness of what you have now, that you're not starting from scratch. I doubt any of you are starting from scratch in these post-occupied days. I'll bet you there's a lot around you. And so the treasure hunt is finding it in your local community, identifying it, and then starting to weave the web, to start to, tie the knots that make that safety net and get these pieces working together. Encourage all your group members to start working with these pieces because you understand these are the pieces of the new future. So thanks so much for being on this talk today, and I hope that it was productive for you, and that you leave some comments through Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joanne, and hope that you'll be with us again in 2013 to further this. And one of our efforts in 2013 will really be diving more deeply into this local economy side and helping build the resource system to really shore it up. So, Joanne, you're providing valuable backbone to this. And wanted to let people know of some other events coming up. We have next week's really full. We have hyper-locavoring on December 11th with Vicki Robin, and you can join that conversation. And she did a 10-mile diet, so her focus is on all the things she learned about it being active in local food and really sticking to her guns with the 10-mile diet and all of her learnings associated with that since she did that almost 2 years ago. And then we have on 12-12-12 celebrating our interconnectedness, so more on the inner transition side, and then our monthly telesalon on 12-13. So please join any of those. And Remember that the recordings are available in our online training archive, and we are offering these at no cost. But if you can, donate would be a wonderful action and gift to us. And there's donate buttons on our website. And without further ado, we'll sign off now. And again, thank you for all of this great work. Bye-bye now.